everyone, and welcome to Ayers Associates webinar on Complete Streets, Adapting People, Places, and Networks. My name is Jan Zander, and I'm the COO at Ayers Associates. My background is in transportation and structures. The hands-on engineering years of my career are focused on freeway, highway, and rural roadway design. That's why my role here is not to be a subject matter expert. We have 3 experts from Ayers Associates, and we have 3 independent experts to share their views with you today on Complete Streets. Our goal today is to help you adapt to the changing transportation and community needs. We will have about 90 minutes of thought-provoking presentations, followed by 30 minutes of experts to answer your questions in a roundtable format. I'll be introducing each of the speakers as they begin, and the roundtable at the end will address your questions. We'll be collecting questions throughout the presentation using the questions box on your GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar display. And in addition, we will be sharing some PDFs at the end of the presentation. So now it's time for our first speaker, Chris Selesky. Chris is an Ayers Associates landscape architect based in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. His experience with research into place-based design, user experience design, and biomimicry are leading the way in thought-provoking perspective in how we view our streetscapes. His work to connect people and place to create community is now being translated into roadway design. Here is Chris.
Can you hear me? Fantastic. Thank you, Jan. I appreciate your time today, and thank you to everyone who has joined us. As Jan mentioned, I work as a landscape architect in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Eau Claire is a city located about an hour east of Minneapolis-St. Paul with a population of about 70,000 people. Home to Menards, Herberts and Gerberts, a thriving arts community, and of course, a bunch of die-hard Packers fans. Before I moved to the land of cheeseheads and dairy cows, this was my hometown. Grafton, North Dakota is a town of slightly less than 3,000 people, an economy that is supported primarily by agriculture, but a community culture that is a close-knit network. There's a history to generations of family members growing up together here, sharing in experiences, creating their own history, telling stories about so-and-so's child going on to be such and such in a much, much larger city. This can be seen throughout America, where a network of relationships helps to support a local economy, and there are hundreds of thousands of towns just like this. Towns where main streets are highways designed to move traffic through, wide enough to drive a combine down, but still small enough for community events. There's something special about this image though, isn't there? A sense of nostalgia with it, a sense of a simpler time when going downtown meant in some way, understanding of your community, and in a way, understanding of your local economy. People still crave this connection or economy of connection, now more than ever. We love to hear a story behind the products we buy or the experiences we have. We love to put our dollars towards ideas we support and believe in. A story is a powerful thing. The ability to tell a story can captivate an audience, hold their attention, and leave a lasting impression. But that story is continuously adapting. The frame is constantly changing, business is open, business is closed. Design ideas go out of trend and others stick around. How can we design for the future adaptation? How can we give our streets structured flexibility? So what is adaptation? Adaptation is defined as your response when leaving your comfort zone or forced out of your comfort zone. Forced out feels super relevant right now. Change is inevitable though. Change in the form of our day-to-day schedules, change in how we work, change in how we dine, change in how we interact, and change in how we use our streets. Let's face it, the pace of change is not slowing down. 85% of the jobs that exist 11 years from now have not even been invented yet. In 2019, more than 9,300 big box stores, physical locations closed doors. And that number is expected to grow to almost 12,000 over the next year. Meanwhile, we are beginning to see multiple dense urban centers, real estate markets like New York begin to drop. New York's market has fallen by almost 30% at this point. This is an incredible amount of change for any person, community, or municipality to handle. So how can we better prepare ourselves for this change? How can we better position our communities to be more adaptable to these changes? How can we design in adaptability? As we begin to think about our response to this forced adaptation we are currently in, we can begin to think about how we can pull theories of adaptable systems into our communities to make them more resilient. How can a street structure be as adaptable as nature? Biomimicry, which is the design and production of materials, structures, and systems that are molded on biological entities and processes, has been a well-known idea for some time now. Now, I want to be clear when I talk about biomimicry. For streetscapes, I'm not referencing just planting trees, painting a river mural, or placing a sculpture of a leaf. What we are talking about is the idea of using the most successful systems nature has provided over 1 billion years to make our streetscapes and communities more adaptable and resilient at the same time. Nature has some of the most adaptable and resilient creatures out there. 2/3 of an octopus's brain is located in its body. An octopus uses this decentralized nervous system to respond to not only outside threats, but its physical environment. Beetles use redundant physical characteristics to solve problems in a variety of ways. And probably the most lasting aspect nature has to provide is positive successes. Nature builds off positive solutions, and positive solutions breeds more positive solutions. Some of these adaptations have already begun to be pulled into transportation design. However, now more than ever, we should be exploring and connecting these systems to our current adaptations to better position our cities and communities for the future. So what are some of the rules and examples of nature's adaptable systems that we can connect to streets, transportation, and human interaction? The first example I'd like to talk about is one you may be familiar with. It has been referenced before. The use of naturally occurring living organisms to solve spatial design problems has been explored by mimicking the foraging processes of ants. But it is a particular form of slime mold that has shown particular promise. Having been adapted to cities around the world and now offering the potential for mimicking regular occurring events such as rush hour, this slime mold is a single cell organism which grows outward from a single point, searching for food sources along the way. Once these have been located, the many branches it has sent out die back, leaving only the most efficient routes between the food source nodes. By arranging pieces of oatmeal on a petri dish to represent railway stations, researchers at the University of Hokkaido in Japan successfully grew a slime mold of the Tokyo railway system in 2010. Since then, the slime has mapped the optimum transportation networks for numerous cities. As the knowledge base grows and information is shared, this algorithm that was developed by using a slime mold of all things will help inform better decision making, not only across the United States, but also the world. Now, the second example I'd like to talk about is nature's ability to form symbiotic partnerships. Nature uses partnerships or relationships to vastly and often rapidly increase adaptability. One interesting example of this is sea crabs carrying sea urchins as they move. This is mutually beneficial for both parties. The sea urchin, because they are oftentimes moved to new areas with higher density food sources, but from a crab's point of view, it's great to have friends who can protect you. Most recently, this same sort of relationship can be seen in restaurants' ability to adapt to food delivery systems. An existing network of flexible delivery systems has helped local restaurants and shops connect with customers outside of downtowns, maintaining connections and continuing sales. The virtual network that made this happen is one thing, and is honestly something I can't even begin to understand. But the physical space that allows this to happen is something we can work to understand better and design better, honestly. A location where vehicles could quickly pick up a package for delivery and head out to its destination, possibly resulting in a more convenient rapid pickup location shared by multiple restaurants. How can further development of these symbiotic relationships and what solutions on the street can we begin to implement? The last example I'd like to reference is probably more relevant now more than ever. Nature uses redundancies and diversity to harness adaptability in times of crisis. One of nature's best examples of this can be seen in the prairie ecosystem. The prairie's ecosystem has a diversity of plant species that serve different functions in the ecosystem, such as nitrogen fixation, water retention, and soil stabilization. Resiliency is enhanced because the variety of plant species is spread throughout the prairie in self-sustaining communities. The plants' varied abilities to survive different types of crises and challenging results in long-term survival of the ecosystem. In drought, some species become abundant while others become scarce. During wet years, the relationship switches, but the ecosystem still functions, providing ecological services. We are currently seeing this transformation happen in travel lanes that support multiple forms of transportation for not only vehicles, but bicycles, scooters, automated vehicles, public transit, buses, and who knows what alternate mode of transportation is next. There is resiliency in designing for and accommodating to these multiple forms of travel. For instance, I'm fairly certain almost no one would have ever foreseen the electric scooter taking off as it has. That being said, it is the perfect solution in a certain context. It can travel well in a bike lane and or paved trails. It's easily accessible and simple to maintain. Another example that has been recently expanded upon is the expansion of outdoor seating into vehicle zones. The reason this has been done across the country with little resistance and oftentimes unanimous promotion is probably understood, but still worth saying. We prioritized one use over another. We prioritized local businesses over the convenience of parking. We began to value the local economy and the connections that came with it. Had this pandemic happened in the 80s or 90s with the boom of large malls, we may have seen a much different solution. With a lack of close contact indoors, completely shut down food courts and malls at the same time, would malls cease to exist? We have over the last few months begun to devalue the single parking stall in favor of certain improvements. What we are seeing in many forms is the idea of a flexible zone, where certain adaptations are free to happen. As we begin to think about these adaptations currently happening and how we can evolve this idea, we begin to think about what alternate forms of installation can we look at. Outdoor dining is great, but how can we layer on uses? Working with a local company here in Eau Claire, we are in the process of developing solar modules that function as outdoor seating, but have the potential to provide charging for electric vehicles, lights, potentially even climate control. This could also be replicated to outdoor workstations where you have multiple connections for power and convenient amenities such as lighting and climate control as well. We didn't stop there. We began to envision different forms of public spaces with hammock lounges, extended areas for shade to help reduce solar exposure, of course, and micro playgrounds. When we view this parking area with a different lens, the opportunities begin to surface and creative design has room to grow. How can we design in our streets the ability to adapt to times of crisis? How can we give our streets structured flexibility? Nature does not plan or try to be perfect. Nature adapts to solve problems in their environment. However, nature does learn from its successes. Positive reinforcement is a powerful thing. We need to never forget to stop and appreciate and learn from our current successes. But what can we learn from the change to help guide a more resilient and adaptable future? An adaptation where we can ensure that our communities have the tools and environment to not only survive, but thrive.
Thank you, Chris. I just want to remind everyone that we will be having a panel discussion at the end. So if you have questions that you'd like to ask Chris or any of our future presenters, so please put those in the questions and we will address that after all the presenters have completed. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Jeff Speck is a city planner and urban designer who advocates internationally for more walkable cities. As Director of Design at the U.S. National Endowment for the Arts from 2003 to 2007, He presided over the Mayor's Institute on City Design and created the Governor's Institute on Community Design. Prior to his federal appointment, Mr. Speck spent 10 years as Director of Town Planning at DPZ and Company, the principal firm behind the New Urbanism movement. Since 2007, he has led Speck and Associates, a private design consultancy. Mr. Speck is the co-author of Suburban Nation, which Wall Street Journal calls the Urbanist's Bible. His more recent book, Walkable City, was the best-selling city planning title of the last decade. With no further introduction, I'll turn it over to you, Jeff.
Great, thank you, Jan. Appreciate it. I will bring up my show. Am I visible and audible? Unless I hear otherwise, I'll presume I am. Thank you for that introduction. I'm hoping it didn't count towards my time because it was longer than I had hoped. But I'm very happy to be here, and I am grateful to Ayers and to APA Wisconsin for this opportunity to speak to you. I started out calling this show Completely Safer Streets with a play on complete streets, but actually there will be no such thing really as a completely safe street. So let's just go for safer complete streets. And I want to talk to you a bit about what a complete street means. Clearly, the complete streets movement is one that's evolved over time. There was a point at which this received funding as a complete street. We've learned a lot since then. And I want to just mention that safe streets are something that I've become more and more focused on. It certainly has never been something I intended to pay much attention to. In my book, Walkable City, and really in all my lectures and my work, I talk about my general theory of walkability and the question of how you actually get people to make the choice to walk. And I talk about how for that to happen, the walk needs to be simultaneously four things. It needs to be useful, it needs to be safe, it needs to be comfortable, and it needs to be interesting. That's a much longer conversation I love to have. Today, we are only going to talk about the safe walk. And we're not going to talk about this aspect of the safe walk. A lot of us now are spending our time retrofitting streets temporarily, or perhaps one hopes permanently, in response to the current crisis. But I was asked today, and I want to give today a talk which focuses on pre-COVID issues, post-COVID issues, kind of these universal principles, at least in our current day and age, that make streets safer or not safer. Some of these will be obvious to you, some of them won't. I think what's important is we need to understand that they all matter. And I'm giving you more than the tip of the iceberg, but not everything. There's a list of about 20 different items that make a street safer or less safe. And of course, we used to talk about crime when it came to safe streets. And now, speaking statistically and paying attention to what statistics tell us, it's really car crashes that are the principal cause of danger in our streets. And so that's what we're here to talk about. Car crashes have declined and then kind of held steady, injuries and deaths from car crashes over the years. But of course, we've been shocked to learn that pedestrian deaths have been rising steadily now for over a decade due to a number of factors we don't need to get into. Angie Schmidt talks about these in her new book, Right of Way. But it's really become more and more dangerous to be a pedestrian in the US, and that's what I'm going to be focused on today. One strategy, of course, is to blame the victim. Try to walk defensively. Of course, Twitter has its fun with these issues, and wearing a bright outfit and making eye contact is all well and good. But really, there's a lot of things the pedestrian can't control, and I look at this picture and I'm reminded of this quote I recently read where DOTs are telling pedestrians it's really their responsibility to stay safe. In fact, the principal responsibility for creating safety in the street falls to the street designer and to the engineer, and it surrounds speed. A car moving twice as fast has 4 times the kinetic energy when it hits you, and a car going 35 is about 7 times as likely to kill you as a car going 25. So all the things that we talk about when we talk about making streets safer have to do with speed. And well, not all of them, but it's really two things. It's speed and protecting yourself, protecting pedestrians and cyclists from vehicles. But so much of it is really just a simple question of how fast are the cars going, and a fundamental misunderstanding in the US in a transportation, I should say, a road design, a highway design, a street design profession that has failed to factor into its thinking for many years until quite recently that environment impacts behavior. And so we have this tradition of creating streets that are safer for drivers that only encourage drivers to go faster and make those streets actually less safe for drivers and for pedestrians as well. So what are those factors of street design that would cause drivers to go more slowly and pedestrians to be more safe? The first I'm going to talk about is block size. This is Portland, Oregon, famously walkable, famously 200-foot blocks. This is Salt Lake City, famously not so walkable, famously 600-foot blocks. This is my family, or a part of my family, crossing a street in Salt Lake City where they actually give you flags to wave in a bucket next to the street so you don't get plowed down. The two cities side by side, built around the same time by very similar people, human beings, but a different model, and a model that has determined whether those streets are safe or not. The fact is that a 200-foot block city can essentially be a 2-lane city on average, and a 600-foot block city tends to be a 6-lane city. Here's a study of 24 different cities in California. If you compare the block size and the non-highway fatal crashes, when the block size doubles, the number the number of street crashes, not on highways, basically quadruples. So that's the first issue. The second, of course, is the number of lanes. As the block size implies, the number of lanes is a huge factor. No one's walking here, one hopes, but people are walking here. And the idea that we can widen streets in order to make them hold more traffic is one that has driven the development of our cities over the past decades. And that's why wherever I go, no matter how often we've talked about it, I always bring up the subject of induced demand. Induced demand is the great black hole in modern city planning. It's still, the fear of traffic still drives most decisions that planners make in cities. The traffic study is the inevitable aspect of any plan that you make to add more things to a city. And traffic studies presume what you see here, which is that you have a certain amount of capacity, you have a certain amount of trips in yellow. When the trips exceed the capacity, you get you get congestion, and you widen the street to absorb that congestion, and you no longer have a problem, which of course has never, ever happened. And what we have in the US instead is what's called induced traffic, where there's a lot of trips that weren't being taken because the principal constraint to driving in congested places is congestion. And that's the operative sentence. Now, if your city isn't congested, you might be able to increase some capacity by so you might be able to increase increase some flow by widening a street. But in fact, if the street is congested, people who were not driving because of congestion, or who, for example, in the American Midwest, typically were not commuting exactly during rush hour, but perhaps a few minutes earlier or later, will change their behavior and the congestion comes back. Today's engineers acknowledge, this is from Newsweek magazine, maybe 15 years ago, today's engineers acknowledge that building new roads usually makes traffic worse. And I read this and jumped for joy, and then I landed and said, well, wait a minute, I'm doing 3 different projects where that isn't acknowledged. And it's very typical that people will agree that induced demand happens, but in their day-to-day activity as a city planner for the city, as an engineer, will ignore that knowledge. Here's the study. It was presented at the London School of Economics, very straightforward. Actually, I have no idea what this means, but I do know what the conclusion means, which is that for every amount of new capacity that you add to a congested system, it will be 40% absorbed immediately, and within 4 years, on average, it will all be absorbed by new trips that it generates. Or sometimes it will be absorbed immediately by new trips, like the $1 billion expansion of the 405 freeway in LA. Now, I share this discussion wherever I go because it just bothers me so much that people ignore it. But then I usually move on because it's a hard argument to win. And I ask a different question instead, which is, let's look at your downtown streets and see if you have some streets that aren't congested, if you have streets that have more lanes than they need. Obviously, the more lanes you've got, the faster cars go, the further pedestrians have to cross, the more opportunity there are for lane switching conflicts. This was Oklahoma City, which, geez, about over 10 years ago, Prevention Magazine named the least pedestrian-friendly city in Oklahoma. In fact, the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country was Oklahoma City. And the mayor came to me and said, what do we do? And I said, let's look at your car counts and your number of lanes. And we know that a 2-lane road will handle 10,000 cars per day without turn lanes. And these were the car counts in downtown Oklahoma City. And these were all designated to be 4-lane, 5-lane, 6-lane streets with these minuscule car counts. So we did a plan. Coincidentally, this new building at the south here, Devon Tower, was about to land, generating $200 million in tax increment. And we decided to spend that money rebuilding all the streets in the 40 block downtown core. My job was to design the curb to curb. A typical street went from this to this. You know, we right-sized them for the amount of traffic they had. Here it is under construction, not congestion. Here's another street, Sheridan through the heart of downtown became this. And, you know, this is what you do if you have money. I always say, you know, if you've got 200 million to spend, rebuild. If you don't, you can restripe a whole downtown for the price of rebuilding just a few streets. That's more the strategy that we've been using in lots of other cities. Here's something you may have seen before. It's called the Classic American Road Diet. If your city has 4-lane roads, these are inherently extraordinarily dangerous. The Classic American Road Diet turns a 4-lane road into a 3-lane road. We've been doing these all over the country. And what's surprising isn't that they save lives. There's obvious reasons why they're safer that are very clear. But what's surprising, and this is a list of a whole bunch that were compiled by Nelson Nygaard, is that if you look at the traffic before and the traffic after, the capacity is not reduced. So when you change a 4-laner to a 3-laner, these are just so inefficient. The driving lane is also the turning lane. This clears things up and you lose 0 trips per day with that change. Here's one in Oakland where, of course, biking and walking went up and crashes went down, retail sales went up. I don't have the capacity data, but you know, the averages, they stay the same or they get better. One-way streets. Now, a 1-lane, one-way street is no problem. I think people sometimes, I don't make this clear enough. I'm talking about multi-lane, one-way streets like this one in Davenport, Iowa, inherently extremely dangerous. It looks like a highway, feels like a highway. There's the opportunity to jog.
Jeff, you're breaking up just a little bit there. I just wanted to bring that to your attention so that you could increase some bandwidth if you have that ability on your end.
Great. I'm going to turn off my camera. Hang on for a second and wait for 1 second more. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you now, Jeff.
Great, thank you. So one-way streets, I won't repeat, but they're inherently dangerous, principally because whatever lane you're in, the other lane is faster. And you have this opportunity when there's multiple lanes in one direction to jockey. So there's the story of Vancouver, Washington, which famously brought its one-way downtown back to life by making it 2-way, which was, of course, a long time battle with the state DOT, and we often have to work with and against DOTs to accomplish these. Louisville, Kentucky, city streets, of these 4 streets, all were 1-way. Brooks, First, Second, and Third. Brook and First were reverted to 2-way. Second and Third were kept as 1-way. The 2-ways, car crashes dropped 48%, and even crime went down. The 1-ways, car crashes went up when this happened and crime went up because basically the criminals moved to the other streets. The high speed flow actually causes crime to be people to feel more comfortable doing drug deals and other things. This is Cedar Rapids, which was principally a 4-lane, one-way downtown. Almost all the streets were 4-lane and half of them were one-way. They had nice small blocks, but they had big streets. This was the current flow, the number of lanes in each direction, and we changed it from this to this, very gradually, street by street, as they were repaved over 5 years, which allowed us to change our parking supply from this, where red is angled, to this. So a lot more parking in the downtown, which helped the merchants. And we were able to change our bike system from this to this. And that's pretty much complete now. And written about, the downtown core is the part you see here. You can see where the conversions occurred. Here's a typical street before and after. This guy over here on the left is still learning how to use a parking space next to a protected bike lane. Wonderfully covered in a great publication called Public Square, which will be represented by the next speaker, who you will enjoy immensely, Rob Studeville. He also covered in this article what we did in New Albany, Indiana, where across the river from Louisville, we designed the two-waying of all of these streets, in fact, the neighbors had to fight for it. It took 3 years, and they did them all in one summer. And according to the police chief, he's never seen a better scenario for public safety. So that's a big help. The width of the streets next, the typical street in America has gotten wider and wider over the years, from 1960 to 1980, same height of airplane, different subdivisions. You see how the standards have shifted, such that my old neighborhood in Miami, we had to lose half our sidewalk because the street wasn't draining properly, and they rebuilt it to the new standard. Wider streets, people go faster. We have the data. NACDO now has identified that the standard 10-foot lane for an urban, busy, mixed-use, through street is the standard again. Many cities have slipped to 11 and 12 over the years, and we're now going back to 10, which is much safer. But of course, for residential developments, for non-important streets, you can do a slow street like this one with 8-foot lanes, or a slower yield street with a 12-foot zone that's shared in 2 directions between parked cars. Portland has been pushing skinny streets for many years with its own city-run program. The developer Vince Graham talks about his project Ion and celebrates the skinny streets that we helped design, quoting this famous planner, let's say. Broad is the road that leads to destruction, and narrow is the road that leads to life. And it's true. Parallel parking, an essential barrier of steel that protects the sidewalk from moving vehicles. This is Fort Lauderdale. You'll notice parallel parking during happy hour is on one side of the street and not the other. This is happy hour on the parallel side of the street. This is happy hour on the non-parallel parked side of the street. Street trees, another big part of the equation. They slow cars down. They do a million great things, but they cause cars to drive more slowly, and they protect pedestrians in situations like this one. This is a artist's interpretation of how a street feels without the parallel parking, without the street trees. Little details like corner curb radii that cause cars to stop before they turn or not, and cause pedestrians to walk vast distances across intersections or not. Slip lanes, which were added to many places in the 60s and 70s, now being removed. This is in Atlanta. A lot of cities are removing their slip lanes, which encourage speeding. And then recently discovered in England, but now we're applying it here in the US, when you remove the center line from a two-way street, the fear that that evokes in drivers that they're perhaps not driving in the right part of the street, whether it's the left side or the right, depending on where you are, causes speeds to drop an average of 7 miles an hour. So that's a trick we're applying to many streets, is to remove the center lines. And here's what they call an advisory lane, something they've been building in Maine, where, oh, there's no sidewalk on your rural road. Let's create a bike and walk zone and have the cars share the middle unless they see another car coming at them. Signals make intersections more dangerous than always stop signs. In Philadelphia, Signals were removed and replaced by all-way stop signs on 472 intersections. We collected data on 199 of them. Crashes dropped, injury crashes dropped, severe pedestrian injury crashes dropped by more than 2/3. The engineers there believe that it's only in Philadelphia where people speed up at yellow lights. But what's important to understand about a stop sign is that no one ever legally goes through it at any speed, right? And of course, everyone sees everyone else. There's eye contact being made. Wheelchairs are safer, bikes are safer. So for the right kind of intersection, in many cities, many of them have signals and shouldn't. They should have four-way stops instead. And when I work in a city, we typically turn a lot of signals back into stop signs. And of course, people are doing a lot of neat things these days with graphics surrounding crosswalks and other things. The MUTDC manual will tell you in the US not to do things like this. A lot of cities are overruling the manual and deciding unilaterally to have interesting, colorful, and eye-catching infrastructure around roadway crossings. Bike lanes, of course, you don't need me to spend much time on this, but it is the protected bike lane, right? The bike lane where the parked cars are protecting the bicycles from the moving cars, like we see here in Pittsburgh or here in Chicago, that is the new standard in American streets. This is Prospect Park West in New York City. Of course, the number of cyclists went up. Speeding dropped precipitously. Injury crashes were down. Even though there was one fewer lane in this street, the trip times did not get worse because people were basically speeding from red light to red light on Prospect Park West. This being New York City, there was a 5-year lawsuit, of course, but eventually the bike-hating NIMBY trolls grudgingly surrendered to reality. And I show this picture to distinguish between the protected lane and the unprotected lane that we really don't want our daughter biking on. People always put things in the lanes if you don't protect them, often in ridiculous ways. And I recently discovered this, the ultimate, the ultimate irony, the Peloton truck in the bike lane, which is a little bit protected, but clearly not enough to keep it clear. But it's really this model that gets you the protection that keeps the vehicles out of them and makes them truly usable and safe. Sharrows don't work. The studies make it clear. When the data came out, I asked my friends on Twitter for a new Sharrow symbol, and there was a little contest, and this one was suggested. But the ultimate winner was what we call the Prero by Queen Anne Greenways. Please don't hit me, but we're not doing Sharrows anymore. They are not bicycle facilities. And when you build a proper bike network of protected lanes, like this one in Washington, D.C., you get things like a biking-only maid service. And of course, this is no longer the image of your typical urban cyclist, the mammal, the middle-aged man in Lycra. This is your image, or statistically, and people talk about biking as elitist, but statistically, this is often the image of your urban cyclist. We've learned more recently that poor people bike more than wealthy people. And in fact, an investment in bike infrastructure is an investment in your least entitled citizens, not your most. So restripe. But I raised earlier the prospect that rebuilding does not make as much sense as restriping in many cases, but I wanted to just end with one example of a rebuild that was not cheap in Lancaster, California. It was done by Moulin Polyzoides. I was not involved, although I've copied it in a recent project in Indiana. And yeah, it wasn't cheap. It was $11.2 million. But the city made an $11.2 million investment that brought injury crashes down 49%, pedestrian crashes down 78%, pedestrian activity doubled, 57 new businesses opened, 800 new housing units arrived, 2,000 new jobs, and an economic impact of $282 million. And I will note that the traffic flow did go down. They sacrificed traffic flow and moved it onto another street in order to have a viable heart to their downtown core, which they achieved. I would note that these days we would do back-in parallel parking, and we certainly wouldn't put a Sharrow next to head-in parallel parking. The bikes next to head-in parallel parking is not safe. Bikes next to back-in parallel parking is safe. But in any case, maybe it makes sense to rebuild in your communities given the outcomes that arise from limited investment. So I've only gone a minute over my time. I wanted to briefly share with you resources. I do hope you'll read my book, Walkable City, if you haven't already. Most people who are watching this show are beyond this point, but if you're trying to convince other people to make cities more walkable or to convince your city to want to be more walkable, this is the tool for that. And then my new book is called Walkable City Rules. It gets much more into detail and has a lot of measurements, photos, and other things. And if you go to islandpress.org, you can get a 20% discount by typing in walkable. So Island Press Walkable. This is the book. Oh, I have a new book and a new cat. But he's taken a liking to Angie Smith's book, Right of Way, which is the best book talking about the pedestrian struggles in America right now against being killed. And then finally, all these resources and more are available at my website, jeffspeck.com. I teach a course at Harvard every year, except this last year and maybe next year, but please get in touch if you want to take a one-day course of this. And thank you for letting me plug my resources, and it's all available at my website. I look forward to the conversation. I really look forward to hearing Rod Studeville speak next. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. I'm sure some of the questions that we'll get in a little bit will refer back to some of the things that you're looking to share with folks. So I really look forward to that. And now we will transition to our next speaker, which Jeff mentioned is Rob Studeville. Rob is a senior communications advisor for CNU, editor of Public Square, a CNU journal, and has written on new urbanism and walkable street networks for 25 years. He is co-author of CNU's Freeways Without Futures reports for 2019 and 2017. He wrote the case studies for ITE's 2017 publication, Implementing Context-Sensitive Design on Multimodal Thoroughfares, a Practitioner's Handbook. And as I slaughter that, I will turn it over to Rob for his presentation. Rob?
Okay. Can you see me? Is everything good?
I can hear you very well. I don't see you at this particular time.
Okay, let me.
You can see your presentation, and now we see.
Now you can see me.
All right.
In the presentation, I'm good?
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was great, and thanks, Jeff, for your presentation. Nobody knows more about this stuff than Jeff. So I'm going to talk about three big ideas for complete streets, and one of them is small and incremental. The second one is a theoretical framework for the state DOTs, and the third is a larger scale idea for transforming the most difficult parts of our metro areas. All three ideas will play an important role in complete streets in the coming decade, I predict confidently. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about open streets. And most of you, I think, have seen these open streets. They've been established in cities all across America. The name is interesting to drivers. They look closed, but they're open to everything else except automobiles. In most cities, these are the most visible changes that have taken place since COVID-19 hit our shores. Many cities have extensively implemented open streets over the last 4 or 5 months. And so the question is, what is the long-term significance of this? Some cities are planning on making these changes permanent, or at least partly permanent. In most cities, however, I predict these will be probably temporary changes. This is an example from Ithaca, New York, where I live, where they put concrete barriers to prevent anybody from driving through. This is another example from Ann Arbor, where it seems they have more trust in drivers. Plastic in lieu of concrete seems to be sufficient. But this is an example of what is called a streetery, where the street itself is used for outdoor dining. These open streets take a number of different forms, and the general idea is to provide more space for pedestrians, diners, and other activities in the COVID era. The trend has reminded people, though, that you can change streets and you can change the amount of space that's given to pedestrians and versus cars in a moment's notice. And streets may be set in concrete or asphalt, but they can change quickly. And sometimes that change is desperately needed. This brings me to the idea of quick build. And this is not an example of quick build. It's one of the case studies that I wrote for ITE, and it is a mouthful, implementing context-sensitive design on multimodal thoroughfares. But the biggest barriers to the complete streets that I wrote about, the 7 case studies, are time and money. On average, the 7 projects cost $5.6 million each and took 5 years to complete. So this is a beautiful effort in San Diego in a suburban thoroughfare. But you know, when it takes that long and the cost, it really does present a problem politically. And as Jeff said, the benefits usually far outweigh the cost on these efforts. And if you do a calculation, you would go for these streets most of the time, but they don't occur more often because the time and money barriers are real when people are making these political decisions. So quick build is a set of tools and techniques that can significantly reduce time and money to transform streets. Instead of 5 years, it may take 6 months. Instead of several $million, it may take hundreds of thousands of dollars to transform a key section of thoroughfare. Quick build can be a stepping stone to more costly and complete changes in the future. Once you've proven that it can work in several times, you can then start to take, you can start to actually transform these streets with changes in the asphalt and concrete. So quick build is described as a bolt down rather than a poured concrete approach. It uses various kinds of surface materials, not just paint, and movable objects like planters and bollards to change the amount of asphalt that is allocated to cars and pedestrians. This is Memphis in the medical district, and you can see how that intersection was changed radically without really changing its capacity. And in this district, they have built 13 complete streets projects using this technique in less than 2 years. And they're working even this year when much activity is stopped. They're working on more of these complete streets projects. So it was estimated that this intersection would have cost $1 million to fix with conventional techniques, but was done so for $150,000. So you can see how the barriers are lowered. The quick build is a semi-permanent methodology. The projects tend to last, or expected to last, 5 to 8 years, maybe 10. So it's a trade-off of longevity for immediate impact. The process is quick because the pavement doesn't change. There's no stormwater impact. There's no topographical survey. The engineers and designers who are implementing these changes are learning a great deal about materials, which ones last the longest, and which ones can last through the weather and the seasons. You can adjust these projects if they're not working out as planned, or even change them according to seasons. And Burlington, Vermont, it's a snowy place where they're using this quick build approach. And some materials like planters or bollards can be stored in the winter and reinstalled in the spring. You can also implement quick build with a routine maintenance schedule, which allows you to apply new coatings and new designs to surfaces when streets are repaved. Now I'm going to talk about a more permanent framework for changing streets. I call this the Florida model, and state DOTs have a huge impact on streets. Many of the complete streets projects depend on state funding, so it's really important that states understand and support complete streets. Florida DOT has created a framework and a model for building context-sensitive and walkable streets that other states may want to emulate. You may be thinking, doesn't Florida have the most deadly streets for pedestrians in the US? And yes, it does. So why should we look to Florida for inspiration? If this new system can work to transform the thoroughfares in Florida, it can work anywhere, and it responds to context. Florida's model is going to affect how the state grows in the future. It acknowledges that streets serve many purposes. They serve as public spaces, rights of way for walking and biking, and centers for commerce and community activity, in addition to conduits for automobiles. This model calls for different designs according to context, such as urban core, urban center, like a main street, an urban general, which is an urban neighborhood, suburban commercial, suburban residential, rural town, rural, and natural. So these 8 context zones cover the entire state. And they represent a new and common sense approach to street design for a state Department of Transportation. Of the 8 context zones, 4 of them are walkable, which is 4 more than the DOT used to acknowledge. The first 3 are in cities, and the 4th is rural town, which is really an urban, walkable urban place. But rural towns don't like to be called urban, so they named it something that did not include the name urban in it. So it's about building the right street at the right place, according to Billy Hadaway, who is currently the transportation director with the city of Orlando, but he was with the state DOT and he spearheaded this new context-sensitive approach. A direct result of reform is to change target design speeds. Minimum design speeds, regardless of context, were previously 40 miles an hour. In 5 of the 7 context zones, Florida now allows lower design speeds. Reduced speeds in walkable context zones have a big impact on health and safety because fatalities and long-term injuries rise rapidly in car pedestrian crashes above 20 miles an hour. The system not only allows the state to design roads according to current context, but it allows for thoroughfares to be designed according to a future context that is planned. This is now a suburban rural area, but it is planned as an urban center. It's in Woodville, Florida. And you really can't create an urban center without changing the infrastructure. And the infrastructure really has to change first or concurrently with the development. You can't do the development first and the infrastructure later. At least doesn't work. Doesn't usually work out so well. So this is what it looks like if you just change the infrastructure and put in some walkable facilities. And if you put in the buildings and on-street parking, this is what it looks like. So the Florida model is the kind of theoretical framework change that we need in our major transportation institutions. This theoretical framework is based on proven design models that have worked for a long, long time, regardless of technology. Now I'm going to talk about the importance of suburban retrofit. And I'm going to take everybody out of the silo of streets for a couple of minutes because it's important to see the wider context for complete streets. There's concern that people are leaving cities for the suburbs. This is due to COVID, the unrest in cities, and the jury is still out to the extent that this is happening and for how long. This is a recent article in the New York Times. If urban people are moving to the suburbs, they will bring their desire for an urban walkable lifestyle with them. But regardless of the short-term demand, there is very important reason to pursue suburban retrofit in the long term. If you're not familiar with Chris Nelson at the University of Arizona, he's a eminent housing researcher. You should be. His research shows a huge mismatch between the housing we have and the housing we need all across the US in the next 2 decades. This mismatch is due to changing demographics and preference, which don't line up with what was built in the last half of the 20th century, really up to 2008. And of course, street designers were a major driver of what was built during that time period. I won't go into details, but the bottom line is that if we have way too many large lot single family houses to the tune of tens of millions of units and too few of the urban housing types. But it's not just a question of units. It's also a mismatch in geography. Here's the bottom line: we can build nothing but walkable communities for the next 3 decades, and still not meet the nation's preference for walkable communities. The current preference, 70% absent other considerations, is growing, and the current availability of housing in walkable communities is 22%. And that gap between 22% and 70% is going to drive land use, planning and development, as well as values for the next 3 decades. One way to meet that preference is to convert failed strip malls and shopping malls to residential and mixed use. Failed malls are becoming more plentiful due to online shopping and COVID. But we need to think beyond even the malls and shopping centers to the commercial corridors that connect them. All of this involves transportation planning and engineering, and I'm going to present a couple of examples. And the first is a case study from Silicon Valley. And this was presented by well-known planner Peter Calthorpe at the recent Congress for the New Urbanism, the virtual Congress in June. The corridor is the El Camino Real, a suburban commercial corridor that runs from Daly City to San Jose, California, 43 miles. Silicon Valley has arguably the worst housing problem in America. 5 counties have a shortage of 600,000 units, and people are commuting from hours away in distant suburbs to the jobs, clogging up roads, burning fossil fuels, as well as adding to household transportation costs. This is what El Camino Real looks like today. It's inefficiently utilized with 6 lanes of traffic on 120-foot right-of-way. If you take that right-of-way and reallocate it, you can fit that same 6 lanes of traffic plus bus rapid transit and generous bike lanes and sidewalks. The land adjacent to the right-of-way is also inefficiently used, and by looking parcel by parcel, they were able to determine that the thoroughfare could accommodate 250,000 new housing units of the kind that are needed, according to the Nelson analysis, and that's 250,000 new housing units, including 50,000 affordable units on a single thoroughfare, with the right kind of transportation engineering and zoning changes. We have these kinds of thoroughfares in every metro area across America, and they could serve a similar purpose in the future. The next case study I'm going to present quickly is in Colorado, a city called Westminster, that's virtually all conventional suburban in form. Their downtown has a mall, and the mall failed. So currently under construction, due to the city's planning, is a mixed-use downtown on the site of the failed mall, and the development is going like gangbusters even today. And here's the street network that is being built on the former mall site. And here's a rendering of one of the thoroughfares on the site. It's starting to look something like this. This is another complete street. The point is that transportation planning and engineering are critical to making this happen. In a couple of decades in the 20th century, the transportation industry built 47,000 miles of interstate highway. Now the challenges are different, but one of those challenges is complete streets. And we need the entire toolbox to build them. We need to think small and incremental with tools like Quick Build, and we need to think big, like a new vision for arterial thoroughfares and for shopping malls that die. And we need new theoretical frameworks like the Florida model for how transportation institutions operate. So that's it for my presentation. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Rob. I'm sure we'll get some more questions. I see some of the questions are starting to filter in now, and like I mentioned before, we'll save those for the panel discussion at the end of all the presentations. Our next speaker is Michael Mole. Michael is the chief engineer for the County of Kauai, where he is using his nationwide background as a complete streets engineer to improve livability. Michael will show us how he and his colleagues are implementing complete streets using new design guidelines and creative project selection and funding strategies. With that, Michael, we can see you now and see your presentation, so I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Jan. All right, my screen's not acting right here, but I'll move this out of the way. Okay. All right, so I'm going to present about complete streets on Kauai. It was great to hear Rob's and Jeff's presentations and watch their presentations, and they're great lead-ins to mine. They talked a lot about the why and some about the what and how, but I'm going to talk more about the implementation side. Really, how do we implement this in a relatively small scale area here on Kauai, but this can be applied pretty much anywhere. So Kauai, unlike most parts of the country, has suffered from the same types of suburban development and car culture that we see around the United States. We think of this might be an island paradise, but this is what we have in a lot of our country here. This is cars, or a lot of our county, I should say. Cars, some walking, but not the most friendly situations for walking and bicycling. But historically, Kauai is been a walking and even bicycling place. There's small towns surrounding the communities, the island, and people walked in those towns. And there were plantations that served those towns, and everybody nearby, and everything was close. But over time, things became like the rest of the country, where everyone drove from town to town, and that's kind of taken over what we have here. So I'm going to talk about the strategies we've used to change things here on Kauai. And the first thing we've done, well, actually, this is not the first thing we've done, but this was following some land use changes to allow to require sidewalks in more situations, and other land use changes and in subdivision code, and also a complete streets resolution. And so we wanted to implement those things by creating this manual. And so what we did is we took out our very, very old standards, 1972 county road standards shown here, crossed out, and our 1984 standard details. We still use some of those details, but our road sections we've now changed. And what we've done is we've created new street typologies. We're taking the old style functional class type street typologies and change them over to something different. I'm not going to go into those details for today's presentation as far as all the different types of typologies. And then we created new street sections that fit better into the complete streets ideas. These were our old street sections. They really just had total width. Most streets were built on Kauai with no curbs, and paved widths were pretty small. Right-of-way widths were bigger. You can see on the left here. On the right, streets with curbs, it just shows a width of the street. There's no indication of what that width is used for. So what happened in a lot of cases is someone said, "Oh, we got to have a major street here, and it's in a somewhat in an urban or suburban area. So let's put in 44 feet because it's a major street." What do we do with that space? Well, we're going to see some examples of what happened with that and what we're doing to change that in my presentation today. This is just one sample of our new street sections. And so what we did here is kind of following on what you heard from Jeff and from Rob. We said, okay, what do we need on a certain type of street? This is a neighborhood connector. This is one type of street. And in these situations, we might need bike lanes. We might need parking. We will need parking in a neighborhood connector. This is sort of a neighborhood business district. We'll need sidewalks, typically going to be businesses or residences or both on the sides of these streets. And so we show let's fit in the all of these things into a cross section. And so we now have not just here's how wide your street is, but this is what we should have inside those street widths. The other thing we did in our design manual is we kept it very simple. Jeff talked about other documents like the NACTO Urban Street Design Guide and other documents that talk about lane widths and you know, there's other geometric design documents on how sharp your curve should be for your speeds. And those are all good documents if used appropriately, even ones like the Astro Green Book that gets knocked so many times with respect to complete streets. If used appropriately and you use the appropriate design vehicles and design speeds, it can work well for designing streets. along with other documents like NACTO. So what we did is we said, based on each type of street, let's pick the design street, let's pick the design vehicles, and then talk about standards and ideas for when we would want to do roundabouts versus other types of intersections. What do our pedestrian crossings look like? How do our traffic control devices look? Just basic parameters in there, and then we reference the other design detail documents. So now I'm going to go into our projects and sort of some of the ways that we've implemented complete streets here on Kauai. So this is what we're calling our lighter, quicker, cheaper. This is very similar to what Rob just talked about with quick build, where we're doing very quick restripe type situations, or bolt down, as he said, as opposed to concrete. And we're doing some of these types of projects. I'm going to give you a few examples of those. So one of these was a simple safe routes to school action plan within one of our small towns, Kilauea town. One thing I'm not going to talk a lot about today is that anything and everything that we do a lot of public involvement. I'm only going to probably mention that in this particular project, just as an intro. In the lower left-hand corner there, you can see some of the events that we had for this week-long charrette that we did. And we're doing something like that for all of our projects to make sure that we get community members designing our streets based on the conditions that they have in their streets and what they know. So this was a situation where we have these typical 20-foot wide residential streets, no sidewalks, no bike facilities. Everyone shares the same space. And sometimes that works okay on these small residential streets, and that is a complete street in some situations. But in this case, it was just too much traffic volume for that to work. And during school pickup and drop off time, there were too many conflicts, as you saw in that last image, and I'll show that one again actually. So we actually ended up, contrary to what Jeff was talking about earlier, converting a street to a one-way, but it's a very different context than what the situations that Jeff was talking about. And so we took this street, but you can see how the conflicts between people walking and biking to school. The school is there in the background, right in front of the mountain. And cars, it was such a challenge for people. So we said for the one long curved block of the street, we're going to use this idea of creating a shared use path effectively, or lane, for biking and walking, and making the street one way for motor vehicles. It also helps with the pickup and drop off activity that sometimes takes place at the back of the school. And so here's when we were implementing it on the first day of school last year. We didn't have all the markings down, so we put in some barriers and temporary things, and you can see just how many people are using that lane. And this picture is actually before not during school pickup and drop-offs. You don't see anybody using it, but you can see the final markings that we placed. Just real simple, put down a stripe, put down some markings. One segment, we use this advisory lane concept that Jeff talked about, where cars use just one lane and they move into the pedestrian lane when they see a vehicle or a pedestrian or bicyclist in that space. They move out of the way, yielding to pedestrians and bicyclists, and move out of the way of their vehicles. So here's the example of that. It's a dead-end portion of the street, not used very much during school pickup and drop-off, but used some, and so it works well for people walking and biking. Now I'm going to talk about our main shopping center area in Lihue. These typical 4-lane to 3-lane road diets. These are areas that were built as major streets, as I talked about earlier. These old standards where there's nothing but 44 feet shown in the in the road width. So they simply marked them as 4 lanes because there was enough room for that when they designed these. And this is a typical suburban type shopping area built in the 80s, 90s, and so we're trying to work our way out of that. And the traffic volumes max out at only 8,000 vehicles per day, so it's an easy opportunity for restriping. These are the 4 streets: Kaneka Street here on the left, Nuho Street, Kalepa Street, and Pikake Street. This is our now failing mall. These are some of our other suburban areas, big shopping centers, and we're trying to do the best we can to make those more friendly for people. So here's an example of what those streets look like: simple 4-lane roads. And these are our solutions: buffered bike lanes, 3 lanes with a turn lane in the middle, typical road diet. We haven't fully implemented. We're taking opportunities to do this, as Rob was talking about, during maintenance activities, resurfacing, or when development occurs. So this intersection here, it's a 3-way intersection. was one of the most unsafe intersections, temporarily made into a four-way stop, which improved the safety but created more congestion. And when a development occurred on the upper side of the screen there, this roundabout was designed and dropped in, and this is that roundabout. And this is directly adjacent to, this is a school sign right here. This is a middle school, and kids can now walk and bike to school in a much more friendly way. And there are wide sidewalks on some of the major roads that approach this too. Another area, this area down here at the bottom side of Newhouse Street, 4 lanes converted to the 3-lane configuration with the buffered bike lanes. And we're going to be doing the rest of the streets as we pave those streets in the very near future. Now I want to talk about some road retrofits and reconstruction projects. Hardy Street was a $8 million federal aid project serving businesses, residences, the elementary school, convention hall, and the civic center. We added bike lanes, sidewalks, and better crossings and a roundabout. One thing we learned on this project, this one was started about 6 or 7 years ago before I arrived here, and we didn't scope fully resurfacing Hardy Street as part of the project. And we learned from that, and I'll talk about that at the end of my presentation. Just running through what we did here. This was an area where right in our town core, the civic center is just to the left. Converted that to this. This, believe it or not, this bus shelter was our central core, our hub for transit on Kauai. And so that was removed as part of the project. And this location replaced with sidewalk, bike lane, and improved street. This is just around the corner, still adjacent to our civic center. Before picture of Aiva Street, which is an intersecting street to Hardy Street. And that's where we moved our bus transit center. And I'll talk about another project that just finished this for the entire street. This intersection, again, was on the list of one of our top 10 most dangerous intersections on Kauai. Just a simple 2-way stop, but curvy streets and high speeds made it unsafe. And we converted that to a roundabout. Another picture of Hardy Street, just a mid-block picture here. Before, no sidewalks. I think there is a sidewalk on the right side. Can't quite see here, but converted that to this. One more intersection just outside the school. That last picture was adjacent to the school as well. And here's a new school crossing of Hardy Street here and the intersection with a minor street into a neighborhood. Moving on to a road called Puhi Road. This was a federal aid pavement reconstruction project, really broken up pavement, heavy truck traffic here. The road was not designed for trucks, but then an industrial subdivision was built in the area. And so a lot of trucks used it and broke the street up pretty badly. It also connects schools to residences. It connects our community college to residences, and it connects some residences to the middle school that I mentioned earlier. The initial design didn't incorporate complete streets principles at all. So we redesigned it during the final design process. And so here was the original section. They said, okay, we're just gonna strengthen the road, build this thick concrete section and put in these 8-foot asphalt shoulders. And the problem with this design is that it not only does it not include anything for walking, although people certainly could bicycle on the shoulders, it didn't make any way to easily retrofit it after the fact. So we came up with a section that actually narrows things, narrows the travel lanes. We left them at 11-foot travel lanes because of the heavy truck use. We didn't use buffered or protected bike lanes in this case because of the context of the road and just the width available. But we showed a sidewalk here, and we weren't sure we even have the funds to do this. We had to find more funds to add the sidewalk. So we came up with an alternative section that doesn't include the sidewalk, but at least would allow us to add that sidewalk on the left side of the sections you saw in the last picture in the near future. And here's what that looks like in a more presentable version to the public. And some before and after pictures again. Before, after. Pretty simple stuff in this case, but it was really a good example of taking what would have been not very useful for people walking to something that's much better. And you can see the soccer fields there where kids play soccer or practice soccer. and better access to that with the crosswalk over to the soccer field. Next project I'm going to talk about is a big reconstruction project, a resurfacing project. It's the original Kauai Belt Road, unchanged since the 1960s, hasn't been changed. 10,000 vehicles per day. It's rural, so it doesn't incorporate sidewalks and really wouldn't given the context, but there are some residences. So having at least some paved shoulders in this kind of volume at 10,000 vehicles per day is pretty important. So we added paved shoulders and added a roundabout to this project that was otherwise just for funded by resurfacing funds. So here's the example of where we're putting the roundabout. It's under construction right now. See how that's going to fit into that location. This is when the road was closed for the Kauai Marathon. This is, Kauai's signature beautiful street or road, the world famous tree tunnel. These are my son and his friends bicycling through here. But when the road is open, most people would never choose to bike here. And in this situation, all we're doing, and this is under construction right now, we're finishing this up in just a week or two, is adding paved shoulders. It's hard to see that they're going to fit there, but there will be paved shoulders, and that's sufficient to allow the kind of cyclists who would use this environment, which is more like a rural commute from, 15-mile commute from one town to the next. It's actually my commute. Next project, our Lihue Town Core Mobility and Revitalization Project, $17 million project with a $15 million Tiger grant. Land use was approved first. Main focus was Rice Street. Again, another road diet, 4 to 3 lane conversion, other components that I'll talk about as well. This was the Rice Street 4 lane, sadly built only in 2002 when other places were already doing road diets, but Kauai was going in the wrong direction. But we've now converted that. Here's the plan view. One more example. This is more of the old historic central business district of the entire county or island of Kauai, and making that a more walkable place. And some before and after pictures. Again, this is in the post office to the left, Civic Center to the right. Here it was a very simple restripe, just adding bike lanes in this case. But for much of the area, bike lanes were not included because the main focus on this is walkability and revitalization, trying to get people to redevelop. This is walk to school day, so you see a lot of people walking in this particular picture, but you can see how much more comfortable that walk would be in this picture. And I don't have walk to school day yet. With COVID in place, we're not doing those kinds of events, but hopefully I'll have a nicer picture of more people walking soon. This is an example of how this revitalization is taking place. This is a before picture, 4 lanes. On the left, see the for lease sign. On the right, this is an empty storefront. That's the old Crest building we had here on Kauai, actually. And looking at the after picture, we are seeing redevelopment. That's now been leased out to a yoga studio on the left, right? And on the right, it's boarded up because they're in the process of creating the Kauai Arts District with new retail and residential, retail, residential, and restaurant there. Another example, another soccer field. This is the main soccer field where most games take place. My son used to walk here from his school to play soccer, and it looked like this. But now it looks like this, a much easier way for him to walk. This is the bus transit center that I mentioned in the other project. This was a temporary thing we did with the Hardy Street project. But when we did our Lihue Town Core project, we finished that work and put in more bus shelters. One more example of this same street, Ava Street. This is the Kauai Museum on the right here. To the left is the historic county building where our county council meets. Again, in this case, it was a 2-way bike lane on the left side of a 1-way street, and then a wide promenade. You can't really see the sidewalk due to all the landscaping. There's a 10 or 12 foot wide sidewalk on the right side. So in conclusion, what we've done here is really think about funding. I didn't talk about this too much with each of the projects, but I'll kind of go into it here. So when we do resurfacing and reconstruction projects, say the funding is primarily intended to resurface the pavement or reconstruct the pavement. Number one, we complete the streets. Whenever possible, we add sidewalks, crosswalks, bike lanes, bus stops where they're needed. And then in more rural settings, like one project I showed, we add paved shoulders. Add those safety improvements. Think about guardrail, roundabouts, turn lanes. And again, paved shoulders are a major safety improvement for everybody. And then we also add minor capacity enhancements, things like roundabouts and turn lanes not only improve safety, but they manage the capacity in a way without creating excess capacity that then results in this induced travel that Jeff talked about. And then the other thing that we learned along the way is when we retrofit or have projects that are sort of complete streets where we get special funding. That Hueytown Core project, I don't think I mentioned it, was actually funded by a Tiger grant that we applied for. When we did that project, unlike the previous Hardy Street project, we repaved those streets as well. And so we use those two funding sources, whether it's a funding source based on preservation or maintenance, or a funding source based on improvements. We do everything we possibly can with both. And that's what's really been successful for our system. So here's just a few, I'm not going to go into the names here, but other projects where we're doing resurfacing and reconstruction, and we're going to do similar things. The top two projects are just like the one that I mentioned. We're just adding shoulders because that's what's needed in those rural settings. And in the town project where we're resurfacing, we're going to be adding things like bike lanes, sidewalks, crosswalks, and in some cases, things like roundabouts. And then lastly, upcoming complete streets and retrofit projects. These are ones that funded or intended to be primarily these complete streets projects. And again, we'll be including resurfacing along with those projects. So mahalo for your listening to me today. And I really appreciate being involved in this session. And I'll be available during the panel discussion at the end to answer any questions or help out with anything I can.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm sure one of the things that people ask about is how you've been successful in funding all these projects, because that seems like it'll be a challenge. I would expect to see more questions on that in the panel discussion as well. But
I'd be glad
we'll
to
now move on to, thank you. We'll now move on to our final presentation before we get into that Q&A, and go ahead and submit your questions if you have them, then I'll stockpile them here and bring them to the panel as we move forward. But our last presenters are Disa Wallstrand and Jeffrey Seward. Jeffrey has been working in the Florida transportation planning and design industry for over 32 years. For the past 20 years, he has been almost exclusively focused on multimodal, pedestrian, and complete street projects. He is passionate about safety, a Vision Zero advocate, and roadway designs that enhance the safe mobility of all users. And he is in Florida, so we heard about the Florida project, so maybe he can bring us some insights in regard to that. Jeffrey will be co-presenting with Disa Wallstrand. Disa, in her 25-year tenure at AIRS, has served municipal, institutional, commercial clients, often in partnership with large teams and broad stakeholder groups. Her experience in the public involvement process inspire her to take broader roles in the local community, including her current service on the Downtown Eau Claire Inc. board, where where the group merge the goals of the businesses, residents, and the city's economic development and planning departments. And to kick this off, I'll turn it over to Jeffrey for him to start.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine.
Okay, perfect. Well, Disa, we've got some tough acts to follow here. I don't know how we got in this slot, but anyway, we're going to talk about how to initiate change. So when I think about change, I like to reflect on the past and where we have been. Remembering the famous quote from a renowned philosopher, George Santayana, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." So from 1956 to now, we're going to take a peek. So why 1956? Let's give that year some perspective. Dwight Eisenhower was our 34th president, and Elvis Presley held 3 of the top 10 recording hits. And just so we're not confused here, Elvis is presented in this picture in front of his brand new 1956 Cadillac. So seriously, 1956 included an event that would significantly change transportation in the United States. The federal government passed the Federal Aid Highway Act. This legislation allocated $25 billion for the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highways. For the next 20 years, the federal government spent the vast majority of their funding on highway construction and merely a tiny fraction on transit. So you can see there from 41,000 miles is a lot of highway. You can drive from New York City to Los Angeles 15 times or around the whole globe 1.65 times to achieve 41,000 miles. This act opened the nation to vehicular travel from corner to corner. It connected cities all across America, becoming the link for interstate commerce to this very day. It also encouraged massive development of rural areas and launched the suburbanization of America. It greatly strengthened the automobile industry, and you can see here it enhanced the love affair with the automobile. Cars were king, and all of our roadways served them well. Then there was a culture shift. Things changed. Fuel shortage, there were a lot of fuel shortages. Gasoline prices surged. Environmental concerns about exhaust fumes, because these cars were only getting 14 miles per gallon. Safety was a growing concern as well. The government mandated seat belts as standard equipment in all vehicles in 1968. Sustainability, quality of life issues, commuting, time spent behind the wheel. However, during all this time, the design focus remained inward facing towards the roadway. Then on July 26, 1990, the federal government passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. This provided regulations for accessibility for all roadway users and capabilities. This had significant positive impact on the streets, offering newly found mobility for millions and millions of Americans. So the street design gradually followed these trends. As a transportation professional, I'm proud to say that we were part of and supported positive change, developing and staying current with regulations, guidelines, and our best practices. This is a collection of the manuals from my bookshelf. You can see on the upper left there, that one's quite used, and as a matter of fact, it was metric, and some of us will remember those days. So, but they're all evolved through the years. We were looking at multimodal designs, adding bike lanes, traffic calming, traditional neighborhood design with our grids and our sidewalks, and integrating ProRag into our designs. And these last two manuals were already suggested from Rob, the Context Sensitivity Classification Guide and the Lane Repurposing Guide. These are the most current I could find. They're authored by the Florida Department of Transportation in July and August of this year. They integrate context sensitivity as the catalyst for establishing design criteria and corresponding design features. So they're comprehensive, and they can be used by city and county for their projects. So this context classification is a key component introduced by the Florida, and it's quite a game changer for our designs. And I'm sure other states have similar documents and planning to support their change. But it's not all about planning and hard design. We need to initiate advocacies. Reach out to local governments and pedestrian bicycle groups and engage them in professionals. So there is always opportunity to change with our organizations, because we surely don't want to repeat the past. So Disa.
Good. Thank you, Jeff. As a policymaker, a community leader, or design and planning professional, we may employ various strategies in the planning process to develop advocates at all levels. Education of stakeholders on why complete streets. In today's world, people live anywhere to work, making that urban mixed-use living more popular. And those people are looking to meet their shopping needs within walking distance, thus they rely on the non-auto access to those opportunities. Remember, the story you tell needs to consider diverse ages and backgrounds that in some have more diverse needs, right? So that sounds like complete streets. We may tell the story of complete streets at public meetings. Michael was mentioning some of the efforts there. And when that discussion perhaps is focused on broad community plans like master planning or CIPs, we're also at the discussions at the individual project level. We may tell the story through our websites. Also at community events, imagine when people are gathering, they're getting to that event through various strategies. They'll be more receptive to information shared through a table or a poster that you have set up at the event. Show the value of complete street investments to the decision makers, right? That's an important step. One of the key reasons that one of the key values is to retain and attract people to your community. Show examples. Examples from your communities or from other communities. Collect the stories about projects, open streets, road diets, other flexible uses of public corridors that we've been hearing about today. Collect those stories and show stakeholders people using spaces in new ways. Document the positive business experiences to the changes. And other examples may come from what's worked in COVID times. We've talked about some of the temporary measures, the things that are in place now. Well, those could stick. So in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, for example, we've implemented temporary conditions on sidewalks and streets to allow such things such as curbside pickup, outdoor dining or retail, or parking day trials. So parking with the emphasis on park, as Chris talked about earlier. And this example shows here too. It's important to listen to feedback from these temporary situations. For example, are they finding these worthwhile reasons to sacrifice that parking stall in front of the store or overall parking spaces in front of the store? Should these become more permanent features? An investment in public spaces is more acceptable now that we have seen a great jump in usage. That again could stick when we go back to gathering again. Think of business meetings in the park, outdoor social connections, movies in the park, outdoor fitness classes, so many ways we are using the spaces now that we did not before. And do not forget to show the stakeholders the opportunities at the other end of the project timeline. Changing maintenance practices can change the function of our connections. The city of Eau Claire was awarded a winter mission grant by 880 cities. I know some of my fellow panelists won't completely relate to the winter image we have here, but really important for the community of Eau Claire. For the grant, Eau Claire implemented winter maintenance changes, including creating a dedicated winter route. So that was plowed regularly and made available for people to access, prioritizing plowing of downtown sidewalks, and using that pedestrian scale lighting to make pathways feel safer on those short winter days. So these were immediately embraced by users, which helps provide the proof of their success. As we tell the stories about successful examples, it will help stakeholders embrace complete streets. Let's learn more from our roundtable discussion. Jan?
Well, thank you very much, Disa and Jeffrey. And I think we'll try to get everybody's image up so we can answer some of these questions that I have started coming in on my end. To kick it off, I want to follow up with what I teased Michael about his success in funding these types of endeavors. So maybe Michael start off, and then anybody weigh in on what successful strategies have you had for finding the funds available to do this, whether it's a smaller investment or some of the larger investments you've been able to do. Michael?
Yeah, yeah, thank you, Jan. I mentioned in the presentation that first and foremost, it's about using what funding you do have as best as you possibly can. And I kind of hinted at this, didn't get into a lot of detail, but whenever you have a project, whatever its purpose, look, see what else you can do with that project. And utilizing the quick build ideas that Rob talked about, and just generally saying, okay, if we're repaving this street, is there anything we can do to make it better when we're done? Whether that's simply just taking out the center line. They just paved my street this week, believe it or not. And there was a center line down my street. It's I don't know, 200, 300, 400 cars a day, maybe. We're taking the center line out. We're not putting it back because there's no point in that. And it makes it safer and easier to walk and bike down that street. And that's a win for me and my neighbors, and it costs nothing. In fact, it costs less than putting the center line back. So that, first and foremost, as I mentioned, whenever you're paving your project, think what else you can do. If you have a retrofit complete streets project, do the paving at that time. It's going to cost less then to come back a few years later and repave. But as far as getting funds, we did successfully apply for a Tiger grant. And one of the ways I think that we were successful is by kind of doing what I just talked about, and that showing how that project did so much. It revitalizes the community. It provides for walking and bicycling. It improves safety. It deals with preservation and maintaining our system. And so that helps a lot in trying to get these grants. And the last thing I'll say is how do you convince the powers that be to get you more funding? And we did that here on Kauai. I didn't mention this in my presentation, but we had about $1.2 million a year for resurfacing up until about 2 years ago. And we had a $100 million backlog in resurfacing. You're never going to catch up. You got to repave a road every 10 to 15 years, maybe 20 for small residential streets. You're not going to catch up with that kind of money. We tried multiple times to go to the council to increase taxes, and we're unsuccessful. But we finally managed to convince them the third time to pass a tax. It wasn't the best tax that I would have recommended for this purpose. We tried first to get vehicle weight tax and gas tax increased. That didn't pass. But we had an opportunity because of the rail project going on Oahu in Honolulu to add a 0.5-cent general excise tax for the county just for transportation. And so we did manage to do that the second time we had that opportunity. And that was simply going to the council and really advocating, look, this is the thing. You've passed all these planning documents that say we want to fix these roads and put sidewalks down this road and put some roundabouts here. You've passed these documents. We can't even think about addressing the improvements that you're talking about until we've addressed maintaining the roads that we have. And then we show them the 100 that had grown actually to like $200 million backlog in paving, because roads break down when you don't pass the tax 2 years earlier. And that time it finally worked. We tried similar arguments the first time and it didn't work, but it got so bad that they finally passed the tax. And so now we do have funds. Now there'll be less funds because of COVID. Our funds are going down. We're not receiving as much tax revenue, but we're still in much better shape than we were before because we were able to advocate for the increased taxes and then use those funds in the most efficient way possible.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. Is there any other panel member that want to chime in on that question? Well, I will go to go ahead, Jeffrey. You'll want to unmute your microphone, Jeffrey, but we can see your lips moving.
That helps. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, we went through that, Michael, here, and you were a resident of our area for some years back then. So in Hillsborough, we had several attempts to add a tax, and it was on the ballot, and then had a failure, and then most recently it was overwhelmingly voted for positively with a movement called All for Transportation, and it was driven by advocacy. I attended multiple meetings in our community, Tampa and many locations, to promote that, and I believe it will go forward. Right now it's kind of hung up in some legal issues, I guess. I haven't heard most recently, but what drove that whole movement is advocacy and the people just having enough of what our traffic was, and it was overwhelmingly approved on the ballot. So when Disa was talking about advocacy locally and we're promoting that, I think that's a huge component of successful funding maneuvers. So.
And Jeffrey, I think Tampa just got a build grant. We failed to get one this year, which is the Trump administration's rebranding of the Tiger program. Tampa just got a big grant. I don't know the details, but it's greenways, complete streets, pretty significant amounts, 10 million or something. So you've been successful in that way in your region as well.
Well, let me throw the next one towards Jeff. And the question here from a participant says, our engineers go crazy over street trees or any objects along the street because they kill people when drivers drive into them. especially at high speeds. How can we respond to them?
Going back to Florida, there was a study done on Colonial Boulevard. It's in both my books, I think, Walkable City and Walkable City Rules. A study was done on Colonial Boulevard in Orlando, and they found that the section of that very same roadway that was identically striped in both locations had considerably fewer, taking actually intersections out. They were looking mid-block. Intersections were fairly consistent because the conditions were about cross traffic, but taking the intersections out, the sections of the roadway that had street trees and other vertical objects near the roadway had considerably fewer crashes and infinitely fewer fatalities, because it was like 6 versus 0 or something, than the areas that had no street trees. So the data is when it's been studied, the data seems to support that street trees make roads safer. I think you need to be, as the new guidelines in Florida make clear, you need to be focused on context. And of course, this term context sensitive has allowed us to get a lot of things accomplished that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to do. And acknowledge that the places where these issues are most important and also worth your spending are these areas where you're more urban, in the sense of not necessarily city-like, but in terms of mixed use, likelihood of people to be walking and biking. I don't expend a lot of energy trying to make highways safer, although things to make highways safer are worth investment if a lot of people are dying in a specific area. But certainly the best practices wisdom now that has been detailed in so many books, including my own, is that if you want to have pedestrians and cyclists and drivers safest within a street, you're better off creating an environment which feels occupied. And one way to make it feel occupied is to have the street trees there.
Thank you for that. I'm sure our listener or our participant will definitely get some traction the next time they have that conversation. I'll send the next one here to Rob. DOT regularly adds turn lanes in intersections in response to car crashes. These make intersections larger and crossings longer. Doesn't it result in more dangerous situation for the pedestrians? And how do we convince our engineers this is a problem? As an engineer, it seems like a lot of these questions are directed toward me. So I'll let you answer that, Rob. Go ahead.
Well, I think you again, I think you have to go to the studies, and there's been numerous ones that show that the streets that are that don't have these gigantic intersections that are safer, and so you go to the places clearly where it's safer, and you'll find that there are streets that are tighter, and the dimensions are tighter, and the crossing distances are shorter. And so I think it's just a different way of thinking. And if you've got a context that is walkable, obviously you have to take into mind the crossing distance and the user, all the different users of that area.
Well, thank you for that, Rob. I got a couple of questions here that are related to bikes, so I'll bring one of those up and look for someone who wants to put their hand up and take the high sign and want to take this one. I'm not sure who would be the best to direct it to. But the statement is data collected for roadway designs is commonly traffic counts. What about peds, pedestrians and bikes? Has the presenter collected bike and ped counts? And how is the data collected? Is it video, observation? How are people collecting that data to make those arguments in regards to the counts for those particular users?
I'll speak quickly. Sorry, Michael, save the best for last, and I'll start. There are new machines available. I saw some recently in South Carolina, but they're all over, that will count pedestrians and bikes. So those are certainly a tool that cities have begun to use. It is important in the public discourse to always talk about the people throughput and not the vehicular throughput. And when you do that, it becomes more equitable. But it's really important to understand that often the volume of people that are walking or biking is a function of the perceptions of safety of that corridor. And there's so many places and great examples that we can cite of corridors that had almost no one walking and no one biking in particular, where the leap of faith was taken, the safe bike lanes were inserted, and all of a sudden there's this huge biking population, particularly if that corridor is part of a more comprehensive network that actually allows people to get from place to place. So it's a little bit dangerous to rely on statistics about number of people walking and biking in places that are currently extraordinarily dangerous or feel unsafe for that. But with that caveat, I would say it is quite measurable.
Yeah, I think the key is getting those before and after counts, right? So one of the things that we're required to do with our Tiger grant is we have to do evaluation. And so we set up a count program for walking and biking on the streets that were improved through and actually some of the adjacent streets that we did through other funding sources as part of the Tiger grant or related to that. And so we in that case set up a system of counts where it's manual counts. We got volunteers to count. We chose like a Thursday in April, back like 3 years ago, I think, before the project started, and did counts in I think 12 spots, maybe around the community, and different times of day, morning, noon, afternoon, to see how many people are walking and biking in those areas. And we'll be getting after counts. Now we skipped this year because COVID was in April. And there's no one walking, not many people walking at all right now because there's no tourists here, very few tourists here on Kauai. So things are very different. I took a lot of the pictures I showed of that project, I took yesterday because we just finished the project recently, and it's kind of sad to see very few people walking, even though we know it's going to be better soon. But we're getting those counts manually, and there are those count machines that Jeff mentioned. We have one of those as well that we're using on one of our major path corridors to count people walking and biking and see the trends over time.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Michael. I don't see anybody else wanting to chime in, so I'll go to our next question, also related to bikes. Is a bike lane if it's not signed and painted? If not and signed and painted, is it just a shoulder or a gutter?
It's just a shoulder in that case, which is what we do in rural areas here on Kauai and most places. But they still can serve a purpose for bicycling. And I mentioned the Run Rural project that I talked about, we're paving right now. That's what we're doing. We're putting in paved shoulders, and that will make it safer for people driving. It'll make it a place for people that you choose to bike in those situations, which won't be your typical kids biking to school because it's a rural setting and getting from town to town. And it's safer for people that walk in those areas. And this happens to be an area where there are a fair number of houses, at least on one of the streets. And so it does provide, there's like 20, we had a list 20 years ago when I was the Oregon Department of Transportation of the 22 reasons for highway shoulders. And there's reasons sometimes not to mark them as bike lanes, because here on Kauai, you mark it as a bike lane, you can't ride a scooter in it, like a Vespa type scooter. And at a 50-mile-per-hour roadway, which a lot of our highways, real highways are, you can't go that fast in the Vespa, and people are legally allowed to use them. So the shoulder provides that purpose, and marking as a bike lane would make that illegal. So sometimes it's okay to not mark it as a bike lane, but it isn't technically a bike lane if it's just doesn't have the markings.
And can I just comment that in my experience, nothing has advanced more quick and changed faster than current technologies around cycling infrastructure. I showed a couple of projects that I wouldn't build today. You know, I was using sharrows 20 years ago. I was using unprotected bike lanes 10 years ago, which means they were built 5 years ago, because that's how long these plans take. I will generally try to avoid an unprotected bike lane now if I can. And then, of course, I had to go to Copenhagen and discover in person what I'd already seen, which is that their bike lanes tend to be up on a sidewalk out of the roadway, or maybe 3 inches above the road, and then the pedestrian sidewalk's 3 inches above that. And that's what we're putting in our projects now, for example, in the Boston area. A bike lane is now out of the road, 3 inches up next to the sidewalk. There's no reason why we can't catch up with these things if we pay attention.
I think Rob wanted to chime in on this one as well. Rob, did you have something to add?
I mean, you know, the bike lane can kind of appear to be like a shoulder, and if it does, and if there's no constraints in the driving, it can actually cause cars to speed up and make a street more dangerous, even though it's called a complete street. So if you have like a 12-foot lane and then a 6-foot bike lane on the side. It just looks like a highway with a shoulder, and you can go easily 35 or 40 on a street like that. And that's not, that's really not safe. So you need to constrain the traffic in some way. And it does help to not to paint the bike lane or make it look something like it's not just additional space on the roadway.
Well, we're running a little bit towards the end of our time. So what I'd like to do here to finish up is go around to all the presenters today and build on a theme which I heard a few of you comment about, that COVID has changed how we approach things today. So I think what the questioner is looking for here is for each of you to look into your crystal ball and say, you know, what are things you think can stay? Some of the things that happened in COVID, you know, the likelihood of them staying or the likelihood of them coming out from your perspective, and what might influence whether some of those things stay or disappear again. So I'm going to take my camera off here, and I'll start with Jeffrey Seward, and I'll just work our way around here as I see you.
Okay, great. Right out of the box. So what we saw here during this stressful time was the adaptation of our streets to accommodate the social distancing and the actual, I would say, fear of the people interacting. There's a couple neighborhoods in our local community, one being Hyde Park and the other being Ybor City, where they implemented street dining, and it was very well received. And you know, they blocked off the lanes, and people just maintained their routine of a Friday night dinner, and they had the ability to social distance, and things were somewhat normal. I think advocacy and input from the public is going to be a huge component of whether some of these stay or some of them kind of drift away. I'm hoping that we've learned how to be. I think Chris used this term, structural flexibility in our designs, so that we can accommodate stuff like that and for the future. So that's my.
Thanks, Jeff. Since you mentioned Chris, we'll go to Chris next. Any insights from your perspective, Chris?
I had to unmute myself. Yeah, I tend to agree with Jeff. The idea of adaptability really came to the forefront when we were talking about this webinar, and how can we put in adaptability into the streetscape so some of the changes we're going through now can be implemented a little bit more easily. I think in communities like Eau Claire, where we routinely hear you can't get rid of any parking, there's a shortage of parking, but study after study shows that there isn't a shortage of parking in downtown Eau Claire, was really starting to challenge how we look at some of the parking stalls downtown. And I think we're going to see a little bit easier time with some of those adaptations for outdoor seating, those pocket parks, those parklets, whatever they end up being called down the road.
Thanks, Chris. Let's go to Michael and your insights into what might stay from COVID and what might not, and how we can influence that.
So I think something that's going to stay, that's going to affect our cities and communities and streets is remote work. Is going to stay to a large degree, not 100% like we see now, but I think a lot of companies are realizing that their employees don't need to be at the office like they used to. And so we're already seeing, I think we're going to continue to see a shift away from people moving out of cities, large cities, and even moving out of the suburbs potentially near those large cities into small towns and resort and vacation destination type places. Like Kauai is seeing the housing market is already high and it's going higher, and people are buying stuff sight unseen from the mainland, buying houses here just to move here because they can work remotely. And that's happening. You know, I see small people are like San Francisco, instead of moving to Tiburon or Stockton or East Bay, they're moving to Sonoma, Napa, Tahoe, places that they may have to go to the office once a month, but they don't mind driving a couple hours once a month. They're not going to do that every day, or take the train or whatever they can do in some places. So I think that's going to significantly change the way cities work a little bit. I think cities are still going to have people in them. I think what will happen is we'll be able to see cities become more affordable again, which will be good for folks. But we'll see. The other thing about remote work is we'll see less commuting. So we'll see less need to serve motor vehicles on our streets. And so we can take advantage of that and build complete streets and do some of the things Jeff talked about, these road diets and taking lanes out of one-way streets or converting one-way streets to two-way streets are things that will be more easy to do in many situations because of that.
Thank you, Michael. Let's go to Rob. Any insights from your perspective?
Yeah, I think there will be some perhaps changes in patterns of living, and there might be opportunities that come out of that. Like if there is more demand for living in small cities, then there will be an opportunity, I think, and really important for traffic engineers and planners to start planning for how to bring these cities back, how to accommodate the any new population that's moving in. And I think there are opportunities for suburban retrofit as well. And that definitely will involve changes in how the streets are designed.
Thank you, Rob. Let's go to Jeff.
Yeah, echoing what the other folks said, I think to the degree that remote work becomes much more normal and fewer people are commuting and fewer people are using streets, then more and more of these places that have given driving space and parking space to pedestrian space, biking space, dining space, hanging out space, will be able to keep those spaces as they become more cherished, and they are becoming cherished in communities. It's interesting that some communities were very quick to make changes to their streets with COVID. Others have plans to do it, haven't even done it yet. I had begun to say, well, if you haven't done it yet, you don't have enough leadership to ever do it. But I haven't given up yet on any city, because now is the opportunity to do it still, as the traffic is relatively light in these communities. And what we are seeing is that as people do it, people love it. And it is going to be hard to convince the populations to change it back. I think we have to distinguish between cities that are more car dependent, where there aren't other choices, and as people start commuting more, there'll be greater honking and demanding to convert those spaces back. With other cities where honestly the amount of, the typical city where you have multimodal choices, the amount of parking on the street, the amount of lanes on the street is just a function of what people are used to. And the induced demand, reduced demand argument means you could actually cut parking, cut lanes, and people adjust their behavior, and it'll work perfectly better and be a much better place. So I think it's particularly in those multimodal cities where we're going to see the most permanence of the sort of changes that are being implemented now.
That's a great observation, Jeff. And before I turn over to Disa, one of the comments that I just saw come on the board was adapting these spaces as we go into winter use. So the question is, are we going to see sidewalk dining yurts? So I'll bring that to you, Disa, since you're very familiar with the winter. So maybe you can incorporate an answer into that.
I love it. I love it. I hope there are dining yurts. Actually, I just saw an example from an artist in town here that gets right to that, like a portable space that you could put in a parking stall. 880 Cities has a lot of great examples too, where people are actually creating these safer, warmer spaces for winter. And if we keep the routes clear, that's going to work. I think one of the things we've heard from everybody today, and what we have all of us as individuals learned during this whole thing, is flexibility, right? We all realize we have to be flexible. We've expanded our capacity for that. And so I think there will be much more readily acceptable opportunities for these great ideas that are out there, because we've had a taste of some of them and it's gone okay. And we've just learned to be more flexible. So I think as professionals, it's a great, as Jeff just mentioned too, it's a great opportunity right now to promote that, encourage it, and see the results.
Well, unfortunately, I really enjoyed this conversation and the answers to these questions, but we're towards the end of our time. So I trust that all of our participants heard today was not only thought-provoking, but also provided some insights on how you can employ some of these place-making concepts in your community. I'd like to thank all of our speakers, and a special thank you to Jeff, Rob, and Michael for joining Ayers Associates in this webinar. as you've been looking, there are some presentation PDFs out there for you to look at. And finally, I would like to thank APA Wisconsin for co-sponsoring the event and providing our planning community the opportunity to earn some educational credits by participating today. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day on a complete street near you.
Thanks.